Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping quietly into medieval times. A world where people woke up each morning, looked around at their surroundings, and without much discussion collectively agreed, yes, this is fine. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if it brings you comfort. And subscribe only if you truly enjoy spending these late hours together. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always comforting to know how far this quiet moment is traveling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Slowly, together. In medieval times, death wasn't a distant concept. It wasn't an uncomfortable topic avoided at the dinner table or spoken about in hushed tones. Death was a neighbor, a very quiet neighbor, one that never moved away, and occasionally resurfaced after heavy rain. Graveyards weren't peaceful, fenced-off places meant only for reflection. They were public spaces, lived-in spaces, social spaces. If you were late for the market, you cut through the cemetery. If you needed somewhere private to meet someone, you stood between two graves. If you were a child looking for somewhere to play, you played among the dead. And no one thought this was strange. Burials were temporary arrangements at best. Space was limited. Bodies were not. Medieval soil had very little respect for personal boundaries. Coffins collapsed. Rain eroded graves. Bones slowly worked their way back to the surface, as if they had unfinished business. Finding a skull after a storm wasn't a moment of horror. It was a maintenance issue, the medieval equivalent of noticing a pothole and thinking, someone should probably deal with that. People responded calmly. Bones were nudged aside with a foot, stacked near church walls, reburied loosely, the way you might adjust a blanket that slipped off the couch. No screaming, no fainting, just quiet acceptance and mild inconvenience. Churchyards doubled as gathering places. Business deals were discussed beside headstones. Arguments unfolded next to graves. Children ran and laughed while adults negotiated the price of bread, all beneath the watchful presence of several generations of skeletons who had seen far worse. And strangely, this didn't make medieval people morbid. It made them practical. When death is everywhere, it stops being dramatic. It becomes part of the landscape, like mud, church bells, or that one neighbor who always smells faintly of sheep. Imagine learning to walk while carefully stepping around grave markers. Imagine being told not to kick the skull because it belonged to someone. Imagine stepping over a loose bone on your way to buy vegetables and thinking very little of it. To a medieval person, this wasn't frightening. It was convenient. Death wasn't hidden. It wasn't denied. It was present, acknowledged, and quietly tolerated, like bad weather or an unpopular tax. And perhaps that familiarity is the most unsettling thing of all. When something terrifying becomes so ordinary that it barely registers anymore. Eventually, medieval Europe ran into a problem that modern city planners would recognize immediately. There were simply too many dead people, and not enough space to put them. Life ended often, suddenly, and without much warning, and graveyards filled quickly. When space ran out, medieval society did what it often did. It improvised, calmly, confidently, with unsettling efficiency, The solution was the ossuary. Old graves were reopened once time had done its work, and skeletons were carefully removed. The bones were not discarded. They were organized, stacked, sorted, very neatly, in fact, because nothing says respect quite like good bone management. Skulls were ranged in rows. Femurs were piled like firewood. Entire walls were built from human remains. Chapels were decorated with them, ceilings supported by them. In some places, bones were ranged into patterns and symbols, just to make it clear that this was intentional design, and people prayed there, not nervously, not quickly. They knelt, bowed their heads, and spoke softly, surrounded by thousands of empty eye sockets quietly attending the service. This wasn't considered morbid. It was considered practical. Bones were reminders of mortality, yes, but they were also solutions to a problem. Medieval minimalism in its purest form. Children grew up attending church in rooms made of ancestors. Travelers visited ossuaries the way we visit museums. Locals gave directions like, turn left at the skull wall. No explanations were necessary. If anything, ossuaries were comforting. They represented order. The dead weren't lost. They were organized, catalogued, watching politely from the walls. Death had a place, and that place had shelves. And this wasn't hidden on the outskirts of town. Ossuaries were often attached to churches at the center of daily life. You didn't stumble into them by accident. You walked in deliberately, nodded respectfully to the bones, and continued with your prayers. To medieval people, this wasn't strange. It was efficient. When death is everywhere, you don't hide it. You stack it neatly and move on. And if living beside graves and praying next to bone walls wasn't enough to show medieval life's unusual relationship with fear, medieval medicine completes the picture. Medicine at the time was built on confidence, tradition, and the firm belief that less blood was always better than more. Bloodletting was the cure for nearly everything. Fever, bloodletting, headache, bloodletting, sadness, anxiety, mild discomfort with existence itself. Doctors believed illness came from imbalance, and the solution was simple. Open a vein. Let balance return. Often, it wasn't even a doctor performing the procedure. Barbers handled bloodletting. The sane person who trimmed your beard could decide that today was a good day to drain you like a leaky barrel. This wasn't alarming. It was efficient. The red and white barber pole still exists today. The red for blood, the white for bandages. A quiet reminder that haircuts and vein management once came as a package deal. If you felt dizzy, it meant it was working. If you fainted, it meant it was working very well. Some people were bled regularly, even when healthy, just to stay balanced. And then there was diagnosis. Without microscopes or lab tests, medieval doctors relied on their senses. Urine became the star of medical evaluation. Patients arrived carrying flasks, still warm, which was considered helpful rather than concerning. Doctors examined the color. They swirled it gently. They smelled it. Sometimes they tasted it. Sweetness could indicate disease. This was not seen as strange. It was thorough. Through it all, what's most unsettling isn't the practices themselves. It's the certainty, the quiet trust. These methods weren't questioned. They were accepted because they were normal, because authority endorsed them, because everyone else believed in them. To medieval people, the danger wasn't bleeding. The danger was not bleeding. And maybe that calm confidence, that willingness to accept whatever the world offered without protest, is what makes medieval life feel so distant, and yet so eerily familiar. So, as you lie there now, breathing slowly, wrapped in the safety of modern distance, let the medieval world fade back into the quiet earth it came from. Let the bones rest. Let the blood stay where it belongs. And if sleep finds you somewhere between these centuries, that's perfectly fine. Bitterness could suggest something else entirely. The medieval doctor would stand there with his tongue slightly out, considering your internal organs the way a wine critic evaluates a questionable vintage. Notes of illness, a hint of doom. Very concerning. This was considered professional. Patients trusted it. Doctors trained for it. Medical texts discuss the flavors of urine with absolute seriousness, without irony and without regret. What makes this especially unsettling is how routine it all was. No one fainted. No one protested. No one asked for gloves. Urine analysis wasn't fringe medicine. It was mainstream. If your doctor didn't inspect your urine, you might reasonably wonder whether he was taking you seriously at all. And remember, these same doctors often moved directly from tasting urine to eating lunch without washing their hands, because germ theory was still several centuries away. From politely knocking on the door of human knowledge. To medieval people, this wasn't disgusting. It was thorough. Health was something you examined directly, personally, and sometimes with your mouth. And if that makes you uncomfortable, that's simply because you're thinking with modern standards. Medieval medicine didn't just cross boundaries. It never noticed they existed. Once medicine had finished bleeding you and thoughtfully sampling your bodily fluids, it sometimes escalated to the final challenge of health care, surgery. And if you're wondering whether medieval surgeons used anesthesia, sterilization, or pain management, the answer is a confident, historically documented no. Surgery was performed while fully awake, wide awake, painfully aware. If you were lucky, you were given alcohol. If you were unlucky, you were told to be brave. Either way, the plan was simple. Work quickly and hope the patient didn't die or stop screaming, which was often interpreted as the same thing. Speed mattered more than precision. A good medieval surgeon wasn't praised for clean technique or neat stitches. He was praised for finishing fast. Amputations were timed. Records proudly mention limbs removed in under a minute, as if this were an athletic achievement rather than a medical emergency. And all of this happened without any understanding of infection. Tools weren't sterilized. Hands weren't washed. Surgeons moved from one patient to the next, sometimes still wearing yesterday's blood like a badge of experience. Germs weren't feared. They were simply unknown, quietly enjoying themselves. Patients were held down by assistants, strong men, relatives, sometimes several people at once. The screaming wasn't considered a problem. It was useful feedback. Screaming meant the patient was conscious. Conscious meant alive. Silence was what truly worried everyone. Recovery, afterward, was a gamble. Some people healed, others developed infections, so dramatic they were described in chronicles with unsettling enthusiasm. Survival was credited to skill, prayer, or divine mercy. Death was blamed on fate, God's will, or personal moral failure, depending on the mood of the day. What's most unsettling is how normal this all felt. People dreaded surgery, yes, but they accepted it. Pain was expected. Endurance was admired. Surviving agony wasn't a failure of medicine. It was a moral accomplishment. And beneath it all was a quiet belief that still echoes today. If treatment didn't hurt, people doubted it was doing anything. Pain wasn't a sign something was wrong. It was proof that something was happening. If medieval medicine taught people that pain was educational, medieval justice decided that pain should also be public, instructional, and preferably scheduled for a convenient afternoon. Executions weren't hidden. They were announced, advertised, anticipated. In many towns, Execution Day was the closest thing to a community event. People planned around it. Crowds gathered early to secure a good view, the way you might arrive early for a festival. Vendors sold food and drinks. Children were brought along, because this was considered a valuable lesson about the world. Parents pointed, explained, and occasionally covered eyes not out of trauma, but out of politeness. Executions were meant to be seen. Justice only worked if it was visible. The suffering was the message. Hanging, beheading, burning. Each method carried meaning, and spectators understood exactly which crime led to which ending. This wasn't chaos. It was a carefully curated warning system. People reacted emotionally. Sometimes they cheered. Sometimes they jeered. Sometimes they prayed. If an executioner did a poor job, and that happened more often than anyone liked, the crowd complained loudly. A clean execution was considered professional. A messy one could result in the executioner being pelted with food afterward. Medieval customer reviews were not forgiving. What makes this unsettling isn't only the violence. It's how quickly life resumed afterward. People went from watching someone die to buying bread and heading home for dinner. There was no emotional pause. Death functioned as a public announcement, not a psychological event. Even the condemned participated in the ritual. Prisoners often confessed publicly, apologized to the crowd, and asked for prayers. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew how the story ended. And perhaps strangest of all, executions were sometimes considered morally uplifting. Watching justice carried out was believed to strengthen the community, reinforce right and wrong, and bring order to a dangerous world. Imagine explaining this now. Yes, we bring snacks. Yes, we bring children. No, this does not traumatize them. It builds character. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Justice wasn't quiet. It stood on a platform and made sure you were watching. At some point, medieval society looked at crime and responsibility and decided animals should be held accountable too. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, legally. If a pig injured a child, the pig could be arrested. If rats destroyed crops, they could be summoned to court. Insects that ruined vineyards were sometimes formally accused. This wasn't satire. This was paperwork. Animals were brought before judges, assigned legal representation, and given sentences. Pigs were the most frequent defendants, mostly because pigs were everywhere and had absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. If a pig attacked someone, it might be dressed in human clothing and executed publicly, because clearly the issue was moral failure, not the fact that pigs behave like pigs. And everyone took this seriously. Court records describe lawyers arguing on behalf of animals with complete professionalism. A defense attorney might claim that rats failed to appear in court because the roads were unsafe, or because cats posed a legitimate threat to their safety. This was considered a strong legal argument. Sometimes animals were excommunicated. Yes, excommunicated. Priests issued formal curses ordering pests to leave an area or face spiritual consequences. The animals rarely complied, but that wasn't the point. The ritual mattered. Authority had been asserted. Order had been restored. What's unsettling is how calm and logical this all seemed at the time. Medieval people believed the world followed moral rules that applied to everyone: humans, animals, and sometimes even objects. If something caused harm, it had to be judged. End of discussion. No one worried about intent. No one asked whether the pig understood the charges. Responsibility was universal. When something went wrong, someone or something had to be punished publicly so the universe could relax again. From a modern perspective, it feels absurd. From a medieval one, it was comforting. The world made sense. Justice reached everywhere. Chaos was being managed. Imagine standing in a crowd, watching a pig on trial, and thinking quietly, yes, this seems right. Imagine explaining to your child that the pig is being punished because it knew better. And as you rest now, far removed from these certainties, let that strange medieval logic soften and fade. Let the noise quiet down. Let the crowd disperse. Let sleep arrive gently, without judgment, without punishment, just calm. And finally, rest. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty, it was order. The idea that animals might exist above the law would have been truly unthinkable. Everything had a place, and everything was accountable. In medieval times, sleep itself wasn't a private, sacred experience. It was a shared activity, a practical arrangement, a quiet social experiment repeated every night. Entire families slept in a single bed. Not just parents and children, but sometimes grandparents as well. Beds were expensive. Space was limited. Warmth mattered more than personal boundaries. Body heat was a resource, and medieval people were very efficient with resources. If you slept alone, it usually meant you were wealthy, ill, or deeply suspicious. And it didn't stop with family. If you traveled and stayed at an inn, you were very likely to share a bed with a stranger, sometimes several strangers at once. Gender separation was flexible. Privacy was still an idea under construction. You climbed into bed, nodded politely to whoever was already there, and hoped they didn't snore too loudly, scratch excessively, or decide midnight was the perfect time to tell you their life story. This was considered normal hospitality. Inns didn't advertise private rooms because that wasn't the expectation. They advertised a bed, singular, communal. Think of it less like a hotel and more like a medieval sleep lottery. You never quite knew who you'd wake up beside, assuming you woke up at all, and weren't slowly eaten alive by fleas during the night. And yes, fleas were always present. They lived in the bedding, the straw mattresses, the blankets, and occasionally on you. Scratching in bed wasn't rude. It was expected. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed they were pretending. Children grew up with this as their baseline. They learned how to sleep without kicking, how to tolerate elbows in their ribs, and how to accept that the warmth pressed against them might belong to someone they had never met before and would never meet again. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Nobles slept in large chambers with servants nearby. Privacy was still limited. Someone was always watching, listening, or hovering with a candle. Solitude during sleep was rare and sometimes considered unsafe. The unsettling part isn't the closeness, it's the absence of discomfort about it. Medieval people didn't feel violated. They felt practical. Warmth mattered. Safety mattered. Personal space was negotiable. Imagine explaining modern sleep habits to a medieval person. Yes, I sleep alone. Yes, in my own room. Yes, with the door closed. They would look at you the way we look at haunted houses, with suspicion and mild concern. To medieval people, sleeping alone wasn't peaceful. It was strange. Crawling into bed beside a complete stranger, on the other hand, was simply good manners. When you live in a world without science as we understand it, you still need explanations. Medieval people had plenty of them. They just weren't comforting. Everything strange, frightening, or inconvenient had a cause. And that cause was almost never bad luck. It was demons, witches, spirits, or someone, somewhere, who had definitely upset God. Nightmares weren't dreams. They were attacks. Waking up sweating and terrified wasn't your mind processing stress. It was something testing you. Sleep paralysis, in particular, was explained with absolute confidence. A witch or spirit was believed to sit on your chest at night, crushing your breath while you lay helpless. This explanation was so widely accepted that artists painted it. No one asked follow-up questions. Mental illness didn't exist as a category. Strange behavior meant possession. Hearing voices meant something had moved in. Sudden personality changes meant something was trying to take control. The solution wasn't rest or care. It was prayer, fasting, and shouting at the problem until it left. If that failed, stronger measures followed, often involving restraints and generous amounts of holy water. Illness itself was moral. Getting sick wasn't just unfortunate. It suggested wrongdoing. Either you had sinned, someone near you had sinned, or God was testing you in a way that felt uncomfortably personal. Recovery meant forgiveness. Death meant lessons for everyone else. Even natural events were suspicious. Sudden storms were omens. Failed crops were punishment. Birth defects were signs. Nothing happened without meaning. The universe wasn't random. It was observant, judgmental, and deeply invested in your daily behavior. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people believed this. It's that the system worked, at least psychologically. Fear created order. Explanation created comfort. When something terrible happened, it wasn't chaos. It was intentional. Someone was in charge, even if that someone seemed cruel and unpredictable. Once you accepted that framework, Everything made sense. You didn't feel powerless. You felt watched. And to medieval people, that felt safer. Imagine explaining modern explanations to them. No. It's just your brain misfiring. They would stare at you with genuine concern and ask why your brain was allowed to behave so irresponsibly. To medieval people, superstition wasn't ignorance. It was structure. The world wasn't terrifying because it was unknown. It was terrifying because it was personal and always paying attention. Childbirth, too, reflected this worldview. It wasn't a quiet, private moment shared between a mother and a trained medical team. It was a community event, loud, crowded, stressful, filled with people who were very confident and largely improvising. Women gave birth at home, usually in their own beds, surrounded by midwives, neighbors, female relatives, and anyone else who felt qualified to offer advice. The room filled quickly. Doors closed. Curtains were drawn. Men were sent away not because things were delicate, but because screaming was expected. Everyone had an opinion. One woman prayed. Another gave instructions. Someone burned herbs. Someone else blamed the mother for an impure thought she might have had months earlier. It was less a medical procedure and more a ritual fueled by fear, hope, and exhaustion. And everyone understood one quiet truth. Survival was uncertain. Childbirth was dangerous for the mother, for the child, and often for both. Prayers were constant. Emotional attachment was cautious. Celebrations waited. Sometimes even names waited. Getting to hopeful too early was believed to tempt fate. If something went wrong, it wasn't seen as a medical failure. It was God's will, a test, a punishment, something that would eventually make sense, even if it didn't feel kind. There was no rage at the system. There was resignation. Women gave birth repeatedly, often while exhausted, undeafed, and afraid. And if they survived, they returned to daily life with remarkable speed. Because work didn't stop just because you'd narrowly avoided death. Midwives held enormous power. They weren't only helpers. They were spiritual authorities. They baptized newborns in emergencies. They judged whether a birth was progressing properly. Their words mattered, and when something went wrong, they were sometimes blamed or worse. Imagine explaining modern childbirth to a medieval woman. You'll be alone with trained professionals. You'll have pain relief. You'll probably survive. She would look at you as if you were describing a miracle and ask which saint made that possible. To medieval people, childbirth wasn't beautiful. It was dangerous. And the fact that it happened so often didn't make it any less frightening. It was normal, and that's what makes it unsettling. Medieval people didn't just remember the dead. They kept pieces of them. Relics, physical remains of saints, were displayed proudly and publicly. Fingers, teeth, ribs, fragments of skulls, drops of blood, and occasionally objects that were said to contain drops of blood. These were placed in ornate containers made of gold, silver, and gemstones, because nothing elevates a severed finger quite like excellent craftsmanship. Churches competed for relics. Towns argued over them. Pilgrims traveled enormous distances just to see them. Owning a relic wasn't only spiritually important, it was economically valuable. More relics meant more pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more money. And as you rest now, far from these certainties, let that medieval world soften and dim. Let the crowds disperse. Let the explanations quiet down. You don't need to be watched tonight. Just breathe slowly. Let your thoughts loosen and allow sleep to arrive gently, without judgment, without meaning, only rest. More pilgrims meant more money. Holiness, it turned out, was very good for business. People didn't just look at relics. They kissed them. They touched them. They pressed them against their faces. Sometimes they were passed from hand to hand like sacred keepsakes. This wasn't considered unhygienic. It was reverent. The truly unsettling part is that some saints had multiple skulls scattered across Europe, and no one felt the need to address the contradiction. If one church claimed to possess the true skull of a saint, people believed it. If another church several hundred miles away made the same claim, that was accepted too. Medieval logic was flexible when faith was involved. Relics were believed to heal illness, protect towns, and prevent disaster. If a city survived a plague, the relics received the credit. If a battle was won, the relics had clearly helped. If nothing happened at all, that too was taken as proof of divine protection. And when relics failed to deliver miracles, it was never their fault. The believer must not have been worthy, or perhaps the saint was occupied elsewhere or testing patience. Saints, like medieval customer service, were thought to operate on their own schedule. From a modern perspective, it all feels unsettling. Human remains displayed openly, crowds touching them every day. Entire belief systems built around fragments of bone. But to medieval people, relics weren't disturbing. They were comforting. They made the divine feel close. They turned death into protection. Try explaining to a medieval pilgrim that touching a 1,000-year-old finger might spread disease. They wouldn't be horrified by the hygiene concern. They would be alarmed by your lack of faith. To them, relics weren't morbid. They were miraculous. And once again, the strange became normal. Medieval people didn't struggle with hygiene. That word suggests effort. The truth was simpler and far more unsettling. They had a completely different relationship with dirt, parasites, and cleanliness, one rooted in acceptance and a great deal of scratching. Bathing was rare, not because people enjoyed being dirty, but because heating water required time, fuel, and energy that were better spent staying alive. Full-body baths were occasional events, sometimes seasonal, sometimes ceremonial, and sometimes avoided altogether because excessive bathing was believed to weaken the body. By opening the pores and letting illness enter, cleanliness, ironically, was considered risky. Instead, people washed selectively, hands, faces, occasionally feet. Everything else was negotiable. As a result, lice weren't a sign of neglect. They were a sign of life. Fleas lived in bedding, clothing, straw mattresses, and floor rushes. Everyone had them. Everyone scratched. Scratching openly wasn't rude. It was honest. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed one of three things. They were lying, they were wealthy, or they were somehow unnatural. Fleas became background noise, like church bells or bad weather. Medieval humor even included flea jokes, which tells you just how deeply accepted the situation was. When parasites make it into comedy, you've made peace with them. Clothing offered no escape. Garments were worn constantly, rarely washed, and passed down through families. Wool trapped warmth and trapped everything else as well. Fleas adored it. Lice considered it premium housing. Beds were worse. Straw mattresses were replaced infrequently, and straw made an excellent hiding place for insects. Sleeping meant sharing warmth not just with other people, but with entire unseen ecosystems that came alive after dark. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people lived this way, it's that they didn't feel especially dirty. This was normal. This was baseline. The body adapted. Expectations adjusted. Complaints were few because there was nothing else to compare it to. Imagine telling a medieval person that in the future people would bathe daily and still complain. They would look at you with genuine confusion and ask what everyone was apologizing for. To medieval people, dirt wasn't failure, it was environment. And the idea of being perfectly clean all the time would have seemed deeply suspicious. Fire was both a trusted companion and a patient enemy. It cooked food, warmed homes, lit nights, and kept wild animals cautious. At the same time, it quietly waited for an opportunity to erase an entire town. Medieval cities were built to burn. Houses were packed tightly together. Streets were narrow. Buildings were made of wood, thatch, and optimism. Roofs were essentially dry grass with ambition. Sparks were everywhere. Candles burned constantly. Hearths glowed all day. Cooking fires crackled indoors. Blacksmiths worked openly in town centers. There were no fire departments, no alarms, and no organized response beyond everyone panicking at once and throwing water in roughly the correct direction. Fires happened often enough that they stopped being shocking. Town records mentioned them the way modern news mentions traffic delays. Yes, another one. Unfortunate. Several homes gone. Moving on. At night, families slept knowing that a single ember could escape the hearth and ignite the mattress beneath them. This wasn't paranoia. It was realism. People banked fires carefully, covered embers with ash, whispered a prayer, and hoped the house would still exist in the morning. Even churches weren't immune. Stone walls helped, but wooden roofs still burned. Entire cathedrals caught fire more than once. When this happened, it wasn't seen as negligence. It was destiny, or divine testing, or a reminder not to get too comfortable. The creepiest part is how accepted the danger was. People didn't redesign cities. They didn't demand safer construction. They adapted emotionally, the same way they adapted to plague, famine, and war. Explain modern fire codes to a medieval person. No open flames inside wooden homes. They would stare at you and ask how you cooked dinner without offending the laws of nature. Fire was necessary. Fire was terrifying. Fire was unavoidable. And medieval people lived their lives balancing that contradiction, trusting it anyway. Violence, too, was woven into daily life. It wasn't hidden or whispered about. It was visible, expected, and structured. Punishments were public by design. Whippings, mutilations, executions. Justice needed witnesses. Pain was instructional. You didn't hear about consequences. You watched them unfold. Parents brought their children, not out of cruelty, but belief. Witnessing punishment was thought to teach morality better than words ever could. Beyond formal punishment, everyday life was rough. Fights were common. Arguments ended in knives. Domestic violence was rarely hidden or punished. A certain level of physical conflict was assumed. War made it worse. Soldiers passed through towns. Violence followed them. Civilians expected it. Safety was an illusion. Strength mattered. Fear maintained order. Children learned this early. Corporal punishment was standard. Beatings were corrective, not abusive. A child who wasn't afraid of authority was considered poorly raised. The unsettling part isn't just the amount of violence. It's how normalized it became. People learned where to stand, when to look, when to turn away. Ritual made brutality predictable, and predictability made it tolerable. To medieval people, violence wasn't chaos. It was structure. And after all of this, the bones, the blood, the parasites, the constant danger, you might expect medieval people to have lived in constant terror. They didn't. They adapted. That is the quiet horror. They woke up each day surrounded by things that would horrify us. And they felt normal. Not happy, not despairing. Just ordinary. Death didn't shock them. Pain didn't surprise them. Danger didn't paralyze them. When something is everywhere, it stops feeling dramatic. It becomes background noise. A skull in the churchyard wasn't frightening. It was a reminder to watch your step. Bloodletting wasn't terrifying. It was medicine. Sharing a bed with strangers wasn't invasive. It was practical. Fleas weren't disgusting. They were inconvenient companions. Even violence lost its edge. Punishments weren't spectacles of horror. They were lessons. This wasn't because medieval people lacked empathy. It was because humans are remarkably good at adjusting to the world they're given. We build routines around danger. We tell stories to explain suffering. We develop quiet, dark humor to make the unbearable manageable. Every era has its own version of normal that future generations will find disturbing. Medieval people didn't believe they were living in a nightmare. They believed they were living in reality. And that leaves us with one last, lingering question. As you drift towards sleep, what feels normal now that someday won't? Let that thought fade. Let the past grow quiet. And let rest come gently, without meaning. Without lessons, just sleep.